Hey there, beautiful people. Welcome back to Black Queer Canon, the podcast. I'm Tre'vell Anderson.
And I'm Mikelle Street. We're here with one clear vision in mind, to put some respect on Black LGBTQ characters on screen.
Yes, every single episode of this here inaugural season, we have been compiling our very own Black Queer Canon. This is a canon of Black LGBTQ plus characters on scripted screens, okay, film and television since the beginning of time. And along the way, we'll be joined by some of my faves, maybe some of your faves, to help us break it all down. This episode, Mikelle, tell the people who we are ushering into the canon.
This week, we're talking about one Anna Mae Harkness, the
Mm.
lawyer and professor at the center of How to Get Away with Murder. So for 6 seasons, if we're being honest, we watched her bully just about everybody in her vicinity. So like students, opposing counsel, her lawyers, sometimes even the judges that were
Mhm.
presiding over her cases. But during that process, we got to see this quite beautiful and complex character be sort of unveiled. One thing that I sort of really loved about the approach of the show was, I think if you're watching a Shondaland show, you always expect for there to be, one at least queer character.
Mhm.
And when we were watching this show, I think everybody from jump expected that to be the Connor character, Connor and his boyfriend.
Mhm.
And so it was interesting to me that they begin to thread in these other storylines that ended up wrapping the lead character, right? Annalise. And so I'm curious for you, what did you think about that approach to kind of foreground, Connor, and then bring in Annalise to the queer storyline sort of later on?
Yeah, well, it reminds me of, I think it was our conversation with Justin Simeon, in which he talked about kind of the Trojan horse approach that Black LGBTQ visibility sometimes ends up having to be. And not to say that that was intentional,
Mhm.
right, when they set out with, anime, but I do think that it applies here because we don't really see any, same sex anything until the second season, I
Mhm.
believe.
Mhm.
But we don't see her kind of self-identifying, claim that language for various different reasons until the very end of the show. And so I think it allowed with this character to reflect something that perhaps another character that was bisexual from the beginning, right, would not
Right.
have allowed.
Yeah.
And so it which I think makes the people's relationship to the character probably complex for various different reasons, but in looking at it, in totality, I feel like it was quite an important device, if you will, right? In the way that they teased it out over time.
I mean, in the end, we also end up with quite a number of queer characters,
On the entire
right?
absolutely.
Yeah, so we end up with
Absolutely.
Connor,
Uh-huh.
Oliver,
Uh-huh.
Annalise. We're gonna keep going back and forth between Annalise and Anime because both are her names, so
Amen.
we can. And then there was Eve,
Mhm.
and then there was also Tegan,
Mhm.
who I will always remember for her pronunciation of Castillo. But I think it was interesting that we end up with quite a number, and obviously, sort of Tegan makes her proclamation of love to Annalise towards the end of the show.
Mhm.
Yeah, you sort of at the end we have so many characters that also represent a breadth, right? So we
Yeah.
have Eve and Tegan, who I think identify as lesbians.
Mhm.
Annalise, who's bisexual. We have
The
the two
gays.
gays, but
Mhm.
not only just gay, right? We have the HIV storyline. There's quite a lot
Absolutely.
going on, which is quite interesting and amazing for a show that was so prominent. You were gonna say something?
Well, yeah, it just dropped in my head. I feel like I came to Schmurda because that's what we used to call it. We used to just call it Schmurda. Well, I don't
Who
know.
is we?
Well, some of us used to call it just Schmurda, okay? But I feel like I came to it thinking that I was just gonna be watching, like this bad bitch lawyer,
Mhm.
and then over time, over those seasons, we begin to see, oh, this is actually a really complex, layered character. The as we talked about on other episodes, the sexuality is never forward,
Mhm.
actually. Even as it's teased out and becomes, something that she claims at the end, it's never the story.
Right. That actually leads to one of my next questions. It might sort of impact it, which is, do we think that Annalise gets her due as a
Mm.
queer character? And possibly because it is not foregrounded in the way that other characters' sexuality is foregrounded.
Well, yeah, no, she don't. She don't. Because I don't think when people are thinking of LGBTQ characters broadly or even bisexual characters specifically, I don't think that this woman
Right.
comes to mind. Um and also, that is probably part of the problem,
Mhm.
right? Just in terms of like how we talk about and think about visibility, I do feel like many folks are like, I want it forward and center and like right up front and no qualms about it. Um, and some queer experiences are like that. You've been
Right.
out since you was 15,
Right.
and everybody know it is cool. On the other hand, that the Annalise narrative of what it has become by the end of the series of wrestling with sexuality, identifying it, not identifying it, etc. Um, it just feels very appropriate in a lot of ways. But to answer your question, no, I don't think it gets credit. I'm not sure which or if any bisexual characters, to be specific, get much credit anyway.
Well, so that was actually where I was going next, which
Oh, my bad.
is that partially because, you know, people kind of like, biphobia, right? It's like people
Absolutely.
kind of identify
And by
bisexuals with
erasure.
right, with whatever they're with at the time. So,
Mhm.
if you with a woman, okay, you a
Lesbian.
lesbian.
Right, but if you with a
But then when you
man,
break up and now you married to this man,
yeah,
okay, but now you're straight. And so
yeah,
there is, you know what I mean? And so, you know, most of her connections in the show are with men. And so
mhm,
she's primarily thought of it. And to that point earlier in the show, right, when she's talking about why she doesn't stay with Eve, Eve is
mm.
like, because you said you wasn't gay, so
Right.
that's why you left. You didn't want to be gay. And you know what I mean? Bisexual wasn't even a term that
Uh-huh.
they were using. So
Mhm.
I am curious if it's that, right? Is that people, whether or not a character has, relations with both, unless they are 50-50,
Yeah.
people are like, okay, but she's gay or she's straight.
Which is interesting because I literally just read some kind of study that came out recently, accounting for the numbers of people who identify, in the alphabet soup community. And most people, according to that survey, identify as bisexual.
Mm,
Which I find interesting because on our canon, I believe Annalise is the only bisexual out of the can. You gotta keep watching to figure out who else is on there. But, I do feel like even though according to these statistics, most people in the community are bisexual, to your point, because of how we move through space and people is just real dense and they just looking at what they looking at and making assumptions that, when we're talking about specifically bisexual visibility, I'm not sure much comes to mind.
right. Okay, I think this is a great place to take a break. When we come back, we'll be here with our great friend, Taylor Crumpton.
Welcome back to Black Queer Canon. Joining us to talk all things Anna Mae Harkness, also Annalise Keating, in case you didn't know. Welcome to the show, music, pop culture, and politics writer from Dallas, Taylor Crumpton. How are you? Thanks for being here.
Anytime, sweetie. I am so thankful for the invitation. I can't wait to talk with y'all.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, so let's just go ahead and get into it. I actually thought the best place to start is just, where did you guys start with Annalise and How to Go with Murder? Like, did you guys start watching the show right when it premiered? Did you guys catch it, later on into the season, or the second season or something like that?
Oh, I was there from the beginning.
Right.
I was there from the very first episode because the trailer was quite, good.
Yeah.
That's how to get away with murder. She had her own little cadence. And so I was like, oh, I got to watch this with Viola. Yeah, I was there from the beginning, but didn't, know that this was, someone of Community until obviously further in the storyline.
Right.
What
And
about you, Taylor?
My mama used to host scandal parties.
Mm.
So she would have
Period.
red wine for her group of girlfriends and chip and queso for us. So
Period.
when the Shondaverse started to expand, it also became a thing that we would watch together as a community. And then when How to Get Away came on, and I think around like season 2, my mama was like, maybe you need to watch this by yourself. She tapped out and I stayed.
Wait, so yeah, I do think that people sometimes forget that like this was kind of like the christening of Shonda Thursdays, right?
Oh,
Like,
yes.
because I think it was like
TGIT,
3 shows,
right?
right? It was like
Mhm.
3 shows back to back. I think it was
Grey's.
Grey's, Scandal, and then How to Get Away with Murder.
Mm-hmm.
And so they did this big like
It
rollout
was a big
for
deal.
that. But I actually do want to come back to this, Taylor. Why do you know? Was your mom just like not interested after the first season? Was it, what was that about?
She said it was a little too adult.
Right.
It was giving that because, with Scandal, every single black girl in the neighborhood wanted to watch it, representation, all of the things. It was the Obama years. Then I think How to Get Away, it started getting more adult, a little bit more mature. My mother was like, maybe you just watch this independently. It's me, my darling. She's a Capricorn woman from the South, so she does have her limits where she's like, I'm gonna leave that to you and the youngins and disappear. And she did.
What do you guys remember your first impressions of Annalise?
I think I just remember the walk. I don't even remember much about the character beyond like had a very distinct walk.
Very
Very
distinct walk. And you, Taylor?
It was really that cut. That cut she had on her hair and the way she had that purse, I always felt like she was gonna swing somebody.
She was always
it
ready to
gave,
fight.
like, church lady, she has the accountant to finances. Like I just imagine her walking through the halls with that purse every day.
That's hilarious.
And like you were saying, Tre'vell, sort of in the second season, they start to kind of, I don't want to say unveil, but sort of begin to peel off the layers of Annalise. And that's when Eva comes in, who was the sort of old love that she had and all that kind of stuff. I'm curious, I actually don't know the best way to work into this, but, eventually we find out that she's bisexual.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the top line question is Annalise Keating good bisexual representation?
I'm gonna leave that for you, Taylor. Go on.
Listen, I love being a bi woman. I'm glad we're having a renaissance right now, especially Southern Black
Yes.
bi women. Shout out to all of us. However, I think looking back now as an adult, like I was watching the series as a teenager when it first premiered, there's just so many tropes that are kind of unsettling to me of like her sexuality not even doing a really good job of speaking to the complicated nuances of being a Southern, like, Black bisexual woman. The way it was written always seemed to very much make her like this morally depraved, irrational, unstable person. And that's already kind of playing into narratives about dark skinned women and Black women. And you're also queer. So I know some argue like, oh, she does a good job of showing like gender fluidity and like not having to come out because coming out still, centers straight experiences.
Mm-hmm.
But looking back, I think there is a lot of harm that was done.
Interesting. Okay, let's go to Tre'vell first.
What's interesting? So when we were putting this list together, we did our best to make sure the whole, LGBTQ community was represented, right? And I'll be honest, I feel like when it came to bisexual characters, we was like, okay, because there are plenty,
Yeah.
Yes.
There are plenty, but good versus bad versus, bisexual characters that had, some sort of mainstream or like, grand, attention or appeal. And, Annalise popped up into the conversation. I think with most characters, right? Good and bad. The reality is, we had a Black bisexual woman as the lead of this show on ABC. There is a level of visibility for the community, right?
Right.
That is. And also I think what you're speaking to, Taylor, right, is like the intersectionality of the character, like the ways that it does in some ways, like, reproduce certain, tropes and stereotypes that we've seen pop up in other narratives, particularly whether it's, darker skinned Black women, whether it's bisexual folks, but that you see kind of the intersection here. I will note that I do think there's something interesting. Maybe that by interesting, I mean problematic. I don't know, but something interesting about them kind of teasing out the bisexuality over the duration of the show. Like she
Right.
don't say the words "I'm bisexual" until what, the last season, maybe the
Yeah.
last couple episodes
Yeah.
of the last season.
Mhm.
Even though we do see, the flashbacks and whatnot. But how do you feel, Michael?
I have a very interesting opinion. I think that
Do you now?
I think that like on its surface, it is quote unquote sort of bad representation. There's
Mhm.
sort of all these tropes like you were talking about, Taylor, right? This idea that, bisexuals are slutty and impulsive
Mhm.
and all of these things, right? But I think that when you really get into, the entirety of the role, I think that if you just look at the first few seasons, it does look super shallow and sort of looks like a walking trope. But I think that in the final season, they end up tying it all together in a way that gives it depth beyond a trope or a stereotype, right? And so they essentially give a reason for all of the things that she's doing that are considered bad representation, which turn it from being a trope, turn it from being a stereotype into being, this is a reaction to trauma, right? Is this and which is real, right? Like the idea of, one of my other questions that I thought about asking was, do we think it's a cop out that she doesn't say that she's bisexual until the final season and the last few episodes? Is this them queer baiting and then trying to get away from being accused to be queer baiters by
Now
officially
let's answer that question. We're gonna come back to that, but keep going.
And so, but ultimately I came to the conclusion that the way that she comes out gives reason to why she has not said it before, right? It is because of the very real, queer phobia, biphobia within the community that we saw as exemplified by her mother, right? You know what I mean? And so I think that like if we're writing something that's going to be real or, supposed to be an example of real life, then is it not real that some people do not identify as bisexual because of, things they have internalized from their families, because of the way that they were treated as children? Is that not real? And so what were you gonna say?
Well, I was gonna just say it could be real and also be bad representation.
But is it bad representation if it's accurate, right?
Ask Taylor.
Right.
I love being the third in here. I don't think it's necessarily good or bad.
Right.
I think that there are highlights and treats. I love the conversations and the relationship that she has with her mother, especially regarding trauma and sexual assault. And I do wish there was a little bit more given about like the regionality, like the Bible Belt kind of thumperness that I think really does play a role into that. Like she is from Memphis, and I don't know if y'all are familiar with Dr. Zandria Robinson. She wrote Chocolate City. She's like talks a lot about like the history of that city in relation to like Black women who were sex workers and how sexuality in Memphis really does have like this kind of blues devilness to it that I like wish could have been interjected more. I think she did a good job on kind of opening up more ideas and more shows to play with black bisexual characters. I think it's kind of like I can't throw out the baby with the bathwater, so I don't want to say that she's good or bad.
Mm-hmm.
But when I was doing research for this, she wasn't even intentionally written to be a bisexual character.
Right.
It was
That's
after
true.
the first season. Then they were like, oh, I think she probably, had an interaction with a woman in the past. I would have loved to see her written as a bisexual character from the beginning and not something added on after the show won a GLAAD award.
Mm-hmm.
What you're saying, Taylor, around sort of it being added on was kind of interesting, right? And you kind of can see how they, were unsure of where they were going with it, I think, because during the process of doing interviews about the show and stuff, like at one point she was called pansexual and not on the show, but I think Viola called her pansexual. And so like they were clearly still kind of
Girl, everybody was learning them words at that time. They was like, oh, I think it's that one. Let's try it on for size.
And so they were still trying to sort of figure it out, I think, and tease it out.
Mm-hmm.
And then it wasn't until the end. And so I found that to be really interesting because, again, I don't know that is not true to life. That the idea that sexuality is a thing that many people explore and figure out. And then, you know what I mean? Like it kind of, again, sort of like peels off in that way, right? Is that you find these things about yourself through these interactions with other people. And so in that way, I did love it. I don't think that that's better or worse to the point of good or bad representation. I don't think it's better or worse than a character that was, originally intended to be queer. I just think it serves a different purpose, right? That was my thing. It's like, I think it would be great to see a show where the character originally was thought of as being queer, as gay, as bisexual, and was always considered that way. And so it informs everything about the character. But I also think, is it bad to have a character where that is not the primary, thrust of the story, where that comes as a part of the secondary or tertiary plot line? I think that's, I think that's plausible and valuable in a different way.
I think so, but I think this comes back to the question you said you was gonna ask, but you ain't asked yet, which is, was it a cop out to wait to have the disclosure, the self-identification happen at the very end, tagged on to what Taylor and you have just mentioned about this aspect of the character coming into form in the second season? We have the benefit of sitting here now and saying, oh, the show is over. We have a full character arc that we can discuss and tease out. But I do feel like we'd be having a very different conversation if those last two episodes, she didn't say I'm bisexual.
Right.
Yeah.
Taylor, do you want to say something there? I think I have something to say, but I'll wait for Taylor to say something.
I'm gonna let you go first, and then I'm coming right behind you.
So I think it's interesting because I think that, whenever we think of these things, you can't think of them in a vacuum, right?
Absolutely.
The reality is that in her coming out, self-identifying with the label of bisexual, it wasn't her just saying I'm bisexual. She was coming to terms with so many different aspects of herself, of who she was, right? The fact that she changed her, right? Like that exact same scene, she's talking about the fact that she changed her name to be more accepted, that she wore wigs to be more accepted, that she was going through all of the things that she had changed about herself, altered about herself, concealed about herself in order to make it. And so I think that it is a disservice to the character and to the conversation to talk about it as if this was just a thing that like, oh, this was the only thing that she was discovering about herself. It was that she was discovering herself in totality. And I think that in that context, do I think that it was probably a very smart move by the writers to do it in this way? So
well, yeah, they're being intentional.
Right, to evade, the idea that like, oh, they just did that as a cop-out. sure, maybe it was, but do I think that textually it served the character, and that it did not, that it's hard to kind of solely identify it as a cop out? Yes.
I understand.
I
Yeah.
think that they did some real work in kind of trying to um, contend and wrestle with the character that they had made and what made sense for that character. And I think that the way that it happened made sense for the plot and the character.
I'm so curious about what we were unable to see. You know, like I think as writers, we often understand that like there's an editor, there's a publication, there are other people, there's many chefs in the pot. And I'm just curious about whenever they went to the ABC executives, we're like, we're going to write this, you know, this black bisexual woman, she's bisexual, this is gonna be part of her character arc and identity. What were the things that had to be sacrificed and what were the things that had to be a priority for us to be sitting here analyzing it today? Like I'm just very I wish there was a recap podcast or someone who was like, well, we would have done this with the character, but you know, we're having to have this show distributed throughout all of America. And at a time where what year did this series end again?
Ooh, 2000. We should look this up.
Wait,
Because it started during the Obama years, right?
It absolutely did.
And then it ended during Trump, the first
2020.
Trump
It ended up in
administration.
2020.
Yeah, I'm just curious of like also thinking about that time and era of like a lot of pushback against Trump at the beginning, a lot of donations were going to LGBTQ orgs, the black orgs, you know, like we're not going back, all of those things. And that also kind of played a way into how it ended of like we have built this strong black woman character and Shonda is diversifying primetime TV and we are standing behind this because would that occur today with this current administration and like LGBTQ representation that's going on? Like, I think I saw recently that it was T.S. Madison and a couple of other queer folks just like signed this letter. I think them reported on it to increase LGBTQ representation in reality TV. So I also wonder if that was like part of this wave in society, in politics and culture to be like, yes, we're gonna put black women on here, and then this black woman's going to be queer, and like, yes, like it's like we hit all of the DEI boxes that are now gone.
Well, you know that sounds more like a just a comment on Shondaland as a whole. I feel like Shondaland, all of the shows feel very diverse, is what we will call them. And at the time, right, that vision, that perspective on storytelling was something that was applauded about Shondaland as a whole. Go ahead, Michael.
No, I mean, that's what I was going to say. I think that, you know, this is how Shonda works. And so I think that, yeah, it made sense for it being a Shonda show. And yeah. I mean, you know, because I one of the things that I think about a lot when I think about How to Get Away with Murder and the queer storylines in particular is, you know, that I don't want to say they kind of tricked you, but you know, you come in and we think that the queer storylines are just going to be Connor and his boyfriend, right? The two guys, and then you end up with this growing, you know, storyline around Annalise and Eve, and then there's even Tegan, and you know what I mean? And so there's this like really interesting thing that I thought that was really well done. But that said, it was interesting to me because I thought Connor was kind of I hate to call it token, but like, Shonda always has the kind of like,
yeah,
she makes sure that box is checked.
Okay, yeah.
You know, I love Cyrus being in Scandal. You know what I mean? And so
there's usually one,
right? And but I will say is generally they follow this kind of path of it's not often that their sexuality is the thrust of their storyline, which is what I always have respected about her shows, and which is, you know, I think that Annalise was even sort of doubly so.
Absolutely, I agree with that.
Even though we're sort of centering it in this conversation, it wasn't really, when I think about the way that people discuss Annalise, I don't think a lot about her sexuality in terms of queerness when people discuss her sexuality.
And is that a good thing? Is that a positive? Like I want to pose this to you, Taylor, in terms of, when we're thinking of bisexual characters, bisexual visibility at large, thinking of Annalise, how does she stack up against, other Black bisexual characters that may come to mind that maybe, their sexuality is more prevalent or not for you?
It's funny as we're like having this conversation, I'm realizing that at the beginning of this series, I was like a teenage girl, and then I went to college and did
Mm.
like every Black bisexual person, cut off my hair, got a tattoo, ended up working at an LGBTQ center. So I too have like had this woman evolve alongside me as I am evolving into different iterations
Mm.
of myself and playing with femininity. I loved the character for wrestling and grappling with internalized biphobia. I
Mhm.
think that to me truly is the highlight of when you hit that moment of identification. Um, I think my irritation just comes with, to me it feels so much like an afterthought. It feels like her sexuality is an afterthought, and I just wish that there was more intention and craft around it for me. And I'll be selfish in that. I will own that. I also understand that my perception of Black bisexuality is informed by my generation. I'm 29. So
Mhm.
I very much came up of age of like, my high school had a gay student alliance, and I went to a conservative
Mhm.
college, and like we were protesting that you could be gay and Christian. I'm no longer Christian. So, but my queerness at that time in pop culture was so sexuality first and forward.
Mhm.
So hers being a little bit more softer, a slow burn, which makes sense with like her generation, her
Mhm.
mother. It's just a little bit of a disappointment to me because it
Mm.
feels like, okay, here you go, you know.
I feel that.
Are there some Black bisexual characters that you love?
It's funny when I think more about Black bisexual women who I enjoy, it's really reality TV. I think
Mhm.
that has always been a space for Black women to, whether they know it or not, talk about it. Like I often think about that Married to Medicine scene where she's like, "What about your lesbian relationship?" Or even like Real Housewives of Atlanta when like
Mhm.
she and like Candy had a moment. I've
Mhm.
seen more, to me, authentic conversations and kind of grappling with this, like, oh well, I'm supposed to be a wife, or I've been socialized to, have a husband, but like, oh yeah, like I mess around with women. Like, even Cardi B on Love and Hip Hop, where she's
Mhm.
like, yeah, I have like a boyfriend and a girlfriend. Um in music, Megan for years has been like, I got a man and a girl, and if you're from Dallas, Texas, you've seen Megan's ex-girlfriend outside. So I kind of felt more authentic, genuine representation, more music and reality TV than scripted, because I think yet again there's so many chefs in the pot, and I also think like the editors are older from a different generation than me. So my kind of go-to girls are the Black women in unscripted TV and music. I feel they do a better job for me.
Did you end up watching True Blood?
It was a little bit too old for me at the time.
That's what I thought.
Not
I was like, you
old.
might be a little
Not
young for that.
old.
I
My
like.
God.
Listen. I do not mean to age check that. I do not mean to do. We also didn't have HBO in the house growing up. Okay, not in that apartment. I started to rewatch it because I think, like most like Black queer people of a generation, we have to go back and watch the shows that kind of first
Mhm.
had it,
Mhm.
and maybe that's kind of like the distinctive like difference. Like I can respect it for what it was and what it was able to do in film and TV at the time,
Mhm.
but I think maybe because I just grew up with more, that it kind of feels a little bit inquadated to me.
Mhm.
Mm.
Mhm. Mhm. I get that. I get that. You can't you can't hate on the young people, okay? You
No, but I think that's very real. I think it's, when you're looking at these characters, even, in the process of doing this, it's important to um think about the context in
Yeah.
which they were being seen and the context in which they were being made, right? And so, judging something like I don't know, Cleo from Set It Off by today's standards, or judging, any other
Yeah.
project, right? From decades ago by today's standards, or your own sensibilities having grown up
Mhm.
today, um, is sometimes a little unfair, right?
Even Annalise, right?
Yeah.
Because in so many ways, that character was historic, was legendary, was doing something different that other character. Y'all remember the scene where she said, "Why is your dick on that white girl's phone?" Come on. That's television, okay? And then also the wig moment.
Right.
So there were other moments in the show with this character outside of this, sexuality piece of the conversation we're having that like made the character of particular interest. But now us, X many years later, looking back at it, with our magnifying glass, trying to figure out what's going on. Well, with that, Taylor, thanks so much for giving us some of your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank y'all so much for having me.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Black Queer Canon is a production of Slayzhon. It is created, hosted, and executive produced by Mikelle Street and Tre'vell Anderson. Chris Rodgers is our associate producer and editor. For more Black Queer Canon, visit us at blackqueercanon.com. You can also follow the show on IG at Slayzhon and subscribe to our Slayzhon YouTube page to watch the video versions of our episodes weekly. Black Queer Canon is supported by Critical Minded, an initiative to invest in cultural critics of color, co-founded by the Nathan Cummings Foundation and the Ford Foundation.